So I want to begin with what I think is the clip of the week. And it's a long clip, but I'm going to play the whole thing because I just think it is really important and it has a lot to say about what is happening in our culture. And I'll show you why in an absolutely specific way. But it's Don Lemon. He's an idiot, but he was just reduced to dust and ashes by a commentator on the Royals, a British lady named Hilary Fordwich. And it's hilarious to watch because Lemon just got demoted to a morning show. He's not going to have his primetime show anymore. He'll still be playing the Black Elf on Rings of Power, where he pretends to be actually a worthwhile human being. But here you'll just see him utterly destroyed as he tries to make a point about some kind of reparations for slavery that the British owe somebody, and Hilary Fordwich just destroys him. Is cut one.
Well, this is coming when, there's all of this wealth and you hear about it comes as England is facing rising costs of living, a living crisis, austerity budget cuts, and so on. And then you have those who are asking for reparations for colonialism, and they're wondering, $100 billion, $24 billion here and there, $500 million there. Some people want to be paid back, and members of the public are wondering, why are we suffering when you have all of this vast wealth? Those are legitimate concerns.
Well, I think you're right about reparations in terms of if people want it, though, what they need to do is you always need to go back to the beginning of a supply chain. Where was the beginning of the supply chain? That was in Africa. And across the entire world, when the slavery was taking place, which was the first nation in the world that abolished slavery? The first nation in the world to abolish it. It was started by William Wilberforce, was the British. In Great Britain, they abolished slavery. 2,000 naval men died on the high seas trying to stop slavery. Why? Because the African kings were rounding up their own people. They had them on cages waiting in the beaches. No one was running into Africa to get them. And I think you're totally right. If reparations need to be paid, we need to go right back to the beginning of that supply chain and say who was rounding up their own people and having them handcuffed in cages. Absolutely. That's where they should start. And maybe, I don't know, the descendants of those families where they died in the high seas trying to stop the slavery, that those families should receive something too, I think, at the same time.
It's an interesting discussion, Hillary. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. We'll continue to discuss in the future.
So if you were watching this, you see Lemon's face just fall as he realizes his legs are essentially being cut off on the air by this woman who's not going to take any guff from him because she knows her history. And yet, this is being sold all across the board, as I'm going to explain in a couple of minutes. But just here's one more clip of a royal biographer. He wrote a book called something like The Last Queen or something like this. Clive Irving, his name is. And he is delivering the same garbage. This is cut 14. Now, remember, this is while the Queen's funeral is going on and while all of Britain is mourning and many other countries that love this woman because, as I spoke about the fact she incarnated the idea of the nation, which the left hates because it means that a human being can incarnate a metaphysical or immaterial principle like truth and beauty, the way Jesus incarnates God. And that's everything that they hate. They want you to be stuck in your desires. They want you to be stuck in your physicality. They want you to care about money and power instead of making your life the full life it can be. And Queen Elizabeth was actually an example of someone doing that. But here is her biographer selling the same line as Don Lemon's, cut 14.
A lot of this seems to be facade. This legacy, it requires something that I haven't seen coming from the Windsor family at any stage in recent history, which is it requires atonement. It requires acknowledgement of the true cost to those colonies of slavery, which began under Charles II in 1666.
It began under Charles II. No one was holding slaves before Charles II began that. Now, I want to quote from Douglas Murray's excellent book, The War on the West. This is his best book, and to give credit where it's due, he is essentially quoting from a history by Anthony Sullivan. It is true, says Douglas Murray, that Britain engaged in the slave trade and that it took part in a trade in human beings that was appalling. But Britain also led the world in the abolition of that trade, and Britain not only abolished that trade for itself, but used its navy to seek to wipe out that trade in all parts of the world the navy could reach. If Britain's decision to abolish slavery in 1807 was unusual, more unusual by far was her decision to send the Royal Navy around the world, establish the West Africa Squadron based at Freetown, and grow the fleet until a sixth of the ships and seamen of the Royal Navy were employed in the fight against the slave trade. This is the Navy that ruled the ocean waves, right? And Britain would never be slaves, and they decided that no one else would be slaves either if they could help it. Murray goes on. The cost of this extraordinary decision was not only financial, it was paid for in British lives as well. Between 1808 and 1860, the West Africa Squadron captured 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 African slaves. They also lost a huge number of personnel themselves. More than 1,500 men of the Royal Navy were killed in action during this period, and the acts of bravery and selfless heroism of those men is worthy of some note. And he goes on to talk about the extraordinary bravery of these British soldiers chasing boats across the oceans, boarding them and fighting for their own lives and for the lives of the slaves that they invariably found stowed away in the holds of ships bound for a wide variety of countries. It was a game of cat and mouse across the high seas, with standoffs and guessing games about slave ships trying to pass themselves off as other vessels. Until the British sailors boarded the ships and searched for themselves, they never had any certainty that they were right in this high-risk strategy. It is a tale of great heroism that carried on for 6 decades. It's also important to note, by the way, that the abolition of the slave trade in Britain was brought about by the rise of evangelicals like William Wilberforce, who was the leader of that particular movement. So it was the rebirth of Christian feeling in the country, evangelical Christian feeling, basic Christian feeling, after the Regency period, in which basically sexual freedom rose and a sense of immorality rose that the evangelicals were conquering. I've talked about that before, but we should always remember, while there were bad Christians, and there are always going to be bad people in every movement, but while there were bad Christians who used slavery, who used Christianity to sort of justify slavery, the true Christians and the true Christian feeling, when it rose again, said this cannot go on, and stopped it not just in Britain, but on the ocean waves where Britain's Navy ruled. Now, because we on the right have failed to understand the importance of communication and the import of culture, and because we're always cranking about the culture and complaining about the culture, but we're never producing culture, we're never doing culture that we love, the left is able to push its lies on every platform. And, you know, if you think this doesn't affect you, you are wrong. If you've ever used the expression, I got an adrenaline rush or a dopamine high, if you take drugs to get out of your depression, and I'm not telling you to stop, I'm just telling you if that's the first thing you go to is, I have depression instead of I'm depressed. I have depression and therefore I have to go and get myself some drugs, or I'm going to find God by microdosing LSD. All of that stuff is because materialism has been sold to us by every single venue that the left has taken over, which is every single venue. We think in materialist terms. We think that we're motivated by sex instead of the desire to find God, which sex basically symbolizes in its search for love. And they do this with these lies of race, which they have used to essentially destroy the American project. The American project, which was from George Washington on, that we would not turn people away because of race or because of religion, but as long as they embraced the doctrine of freedom. Slavery was a violation of that principle, as even the founders knew. Even some of the founders who held slaves knew it, and those who didn't know it learned it, a lot of them, over time. It was a violation of our principles, and everyone knew it was a thorn in the side, but history decreed that they could not build the country until they let the South keep the slaves on which its economy depended. And it led to civil war, and as Lincoln said, every drop of blood that was shed by the lash was paid for by blood shed by the sword. So this week, right, and so the left is pouring this effort into dividing us by race, and this critical race theory, which they claim is not being taught in schools, because it's not being taught in schools. It simply affects everything that is being taught in schools. They're teaching us that there is something inherently oppressive in whiteness and white culture. This week, to sort of drive that message home, The top movie released was a movie called The Woman King with the absolutely great actress Viola Davis. Here's the trailer. It's cut 3.
An evil is coming that threatens our kingdom, our freedom. But we have a weapon they are not prepared for.
My king, the Europeans wish to conquer us. They will not stop until the whole of Africa is theirs. We must fight back for our people.
So I haven't seen the movie. This is not a review of the movie at all. Anything with Viola Davis in it is going to at least have one great performance. The movie's not getting good reviews, but I haven't seen it, so I'm not reviewing the picture. But here's basically the story. I'm taking this from Wikipedia. In the West African kingdom of Dahomey, during the 1820s, General Naniska, leader of the all-female group of warriors, the Agoji, liberates Dahomean women who were abducted by slavers from the Oyo Empire, and this provokes King Gezo of Dahomey to prepare for an all-out war with the Oyo. Naniska begins to train a new generation of warriors to join the Agoji in order to protect the kingdom. Now, whenever they write an article about this, is this true? The article always starts, well, yes, it's true, but there are creative liberties. Garbage. The morality of the entire picture is a lie. Dahomey monopolized the slave trade in Africa. It was a slave-trading kingdom that conquered the other kingdoms during the 18th century and basically became the biggest slave traders in Africa. The Oyos were competing slave traders. That's why they went after them. And the wars that were meant to capture their fellow Africans and use them as slaves and sell them to, and keep them for themselves and sell them to other African kingdoms and then eventually to the Europeans, those wars meant that so many men were being killed. They were at war so often that they basically had to bring in these women and train them to be warriors as well. But what they did was just amazing. Here's Dan McLaughlin, who writes a very long article about this at National Review, but it's an excellent article. I'm going to read a bit of it. He says, throughout its history, the transatlantic slave trade was truly a trade, a voluntary exchange in which African kings and merchants engaged for their own perceived benefit. Virtually all of the nearly 25 million Africans sold into slavery down through the centuries, roughly half of them in the Atlantic slave trade, were taken and sold by fellow Africans. Dahomey, he writes, was not merely a nation that engaged in slavery or slave trading. It was a kingdom built on enslavement. So as I said, so many people were killed in these slave raids and these wars that they had to create a female force that the Europeans called the Black Amazons. And visitors were very impressed by the Amazons. They were really good soldiers, and they were very good at training. One observer noted that the women shot their antiquated flintlock muskets from the shoulder, which is the proper way to fire them so you can control the weapon, while the men shot from the hip, which was a chronic bad habit of African soldiers. They were ferocious in the getting of slaves. And basically their job was to go into the undefended villages around where there was nobody, there was no army to defend them, attack them in the dead of night, round up the slaves and cut the throats and behead anyone who stood in their way. At the same time, this king, there were many kings, obviously, over this period. It was over more than 100 years. The king was a dictator. It was one of the more absolute monarchies that there was in Africa. He would kill anyone who would compete with his slave trade, but he also kept these Amazons as wives. Now, he kept them in their palace where there were no other men but eunuchs. They were not allowed to sleep with anybody else. Whether they slept with him is uncertain. We don't know about that, but in other words, they were basically his slaves. They were basically working only for him. So in other words, if you were to judge the Dahomey under the same woke principles that you're judging the British, you would have to say these are the worst people who ever existed. They were sexist, they were patriarchal, they were slave-taking jackasses, all right? Now, they had how'd they get into a fight with the French? Well, they had terrible relations with the British because the British wanted to ban their slave trade, and the Dahomeys were living off the slave trade. They didn't want to give it up. British abolitionists and mercenaries were basically saying the only way we can get these Africans to stop selling slaves is to convert them to Christianity and to teach them how to sell palm oil and other things, which they didn't want to do. They didn't want to give up their slave trade. That puts a really different face on the British Empire, and I keep telling you, the British Empire was a civilizing force. So this King Gezo, who's the hero, one of the heroes of the film, he was the one who was saying to the British, we don't want to give up our slaves, and that's why they started dealing with the French, and that ultimately led to war with the French, in which the Amazons, the Goju, were basically wiped out. They'd already been destroyed in other battles, but they were wiped out. So, why are they lying? Why do they have to constantly lie? Why can't we just tell history the way it was? Well, one of the things, Bill Maher has been picking up on this. Bill Maher basically is now just smoking dope to keep from finding God. That's my theory about Bill Maher. He's always smoking dope on one of his screening shows. He's doing it because he can't face the fact that everything he thought before was untrue. And now he's after woke history. Here's cut 5 of Bill Maher talking about this.
We're a species prone to making others of our species our bitch. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Humans are not good people. And the capacity for cruelty is a human thing, not a white thing. That's the truth, even though it doesn't jibe with the current narrative. But in today's world, when truth conflicts with narrative, it's the truth that has to apologize. Being woke is like a magic moral time machine where you judge everybody against what you imagine you would have done in 1066, and you always win.
So the thing that's so brilliant about those remarks is, first, obviously, cruelty, brutality, slavery, atrocity. These are not black things or white things. These are human things. These are the things that bind us together in sin. And that is, of course, why we are here in America trying to get rid of those things as a one people, out of the many becoming one. And yes, there have been wrongs done to the black race in America, but there've been wrongs done to everybody everywhere, and that is the whole point of America. But the other thing that's really smart about Bill Maher is he's showing you that this is personal. What they are saying is you are a better person for these lies. Here's the cast of the Woman King coming on The View, and listen to how personal they make it all. It's cut 4.
You've said that friends and family and even strangers have shared anecdotes with you about what this movie means to them. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, one of my friends, who's an actress, Joan Ayola, back at home, I sent her the trailer when it came out, and she messaged me back saying, I'm crying in the middle of the street, and I just forced 3 random people to watch it. She just grabbed people and was like, look at this! Look at this film!
Everyone needs a friend like
that. There have been so many responses like that. I think seeing the trailer, just seeing the image of us all coming out of the gate, you know, it's conjured up feelings in people that I don't think they even knew were there. So it's really beautiful.
It's just so beautiful. And you're also beautiful. It's breathtaking.
Oh, you're so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And the women are so affirmed. And they saw the women coming out of the grass with swords. So let me ask you a question. So it's all personal, right? These lies are there for you. They're there to make you feel better. That female affirmation, you feel so much better. You're a strong woman. There are no strong women. And the reason I say that is because for every woman, no matter how strong, there is a stronger man. That's the whole point. One of the things about being a woman that you have to deal with if you are in fact a real woman and not a make-believe one. Let me ask you this, though. Should women be affirmed by seeing these women with swords coming out of the grass and how tough they were and how they got slaves and cut off the head of anyone who tried to stop them? Or do we look at this and say, hey, this was a king who was a slaver. This was a king who was a fascist. This was a king who kept the women for himself and cut off the testicles of anyone else who tried to come near them. Maybe all that deformity, maybe all that oppression and deforming women into these vicious killers, maybe that's all one thing. Maybe it shouldn't be affirming. Maybe a picture of, say, the Pieta or the Virgin Mary with her child. Maybe that should be more affirming, but at least we should ask that question. But turning history to personal empowerment means that when you call out a lie, as a lie, you're attacking people personally, and that's why they get offended. And that is also why these lies start to drive people absolutely insane. If you want more great content, like and subscribe to the Andrew Klavan Podcast.